Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on Chapter 2 of our source text, and we're looking exclusively at the author's precise logical argument for why physical healing is universally intended. We're going to completely unpack the architecture of this argument, specifically from the chapter called The Will of God for Physical Healing, and see exactly how the author pieces the whole thing together.
Okay, here's our roadmap for Chapter 2. We're looking at 4 things. Number 1, the will for physical healing. 2, the example of Jesus. 3, known versus unknown will. And finally, 4, avoiding the double mind. Let's get to it.
Starting with Part 1, the will for physical healing, and addressing the ultimate objection. Right out of the gate, the text really challenges this common assumption we hear all the time, the idea that if someone isn't healed, it simply wasn't God's will. The author argues that jumping to that conclusion is actually faulty logic based on New Testament scriptures. But, they realize they have to clear a massive, unavoidable hurdle to make this case work.
Because obviously we have to ask, if it is God's will to heal, why do Christians die? Seriously, what if someone isn't healed and passes away? How on earth does the author logically reconcile that reality with their core premise? Like, if you pray for a fellow believer and they die, how can it possibly be God's will for absolutely everyone to be healed? Well, the text points to scriptures like Ecclesiastes to acknowledge that yes, there is an appointed time to die, and a set time for man on earth.
So the crucial takeaway here is that earthly healing is, by definition, a temporary fix. Based on the author's logic, we obviously can't just keep getting healed over and over forever just to stay on earth. But, and this is the absolute hinge of the whole argument, as long as it's God's will for a person to remain on earth, the text argues it is also His will for them to be healed. In this framework, death isn't seen as a failure to heal. Actually, scratch that, it's viewed as the ultimate healing, giving the believer an eternally healthy body that will literally never experience sickness again.
Moving on to Part 2, the example of Jesus, the perfect expression of the Father's will. Let's see how the author uses the historical ministry of Jesus to really validate this premise. The text asserts that Jesus came down from heaven specifically to do His Father's will. So, the logic goes, if we look at exactly what Jesus did, we can deduce exactly what the Father's will actually is.
And notice these specific scriptural quotes from Matthew and Luke. The text rapid fires through these verses and places a massive emphasis on words like all and every. The author argues that Jesus never, not even once, turned away a sick person because it supposedly wasn't God's will to heal them. You just never read about Jesus healing some people while intentionally leaving others out. Even in His hometown, where, very few were actually healed, it's clarified that this was due to the people rejecting Him in unbelief, not at all because God didn't want to heal them.
According to the author's standards, the logic here is pretty much airtight. If it wasn't God's will for every single person to be healed, then Jesus would have actively misrepresented His Father by going around healing everyone He met. Because the text firmly holds that Jesus could do nothing on His own, but only what He saw the Father do, His unconditional healing of the multitudes is presented as the absolute, definitive proof that divine healing is universal.
All right, Part 3, known versus unknown, will, and the legal metaphor. This is where these big, abstract theological concepts get highly practical for us.
The author compares Scripture directly to a last will and testament. Think about it. Once you discover you're named in a will, you have the absolute legal right to claim the inheritance that belongs to you, right? Just as a physical will goes into effect after the person dies, the text argues that the New Testament scriptures are Jesus' known will, which is now completely in force because He died and rose again to oversee it. You don't sit around wondering if a rich relative wants you to have the money once it's written in a legal document. No way. You simply step up and claim it.
And that brings us to Part 4. Avoiding the double mind, the barrier to receiving. This is honestly probably the most nuanced concept in Chapter 2. The author argues that if you don't understand that legal framework we just talked about, you end up creating a massive psychological and spiritual barrier for yourself.
So, to really grasp this, we have to ask, based on all this deductive logic, how exactly should a person pray if they want to claim physical healing? I mean, if healing is a guaranteed inheritance perfectly documented in a legal-style testament, approaching your request with any kind of uncertainty is considered totally the wrong methodology.
The difference between these two categories brilliantly illustrates the core distinction of the chapter. For the unknown will, things like choosing a job, picking a house, or who to marry, you absolutely should pray, if it be thy will. But for the known will, established in the testament, like salvation or physical healing, praying if it be thy will makes absolutely zero sense to the author. Think about it. You wouldn't ask God to save a soul if it's His will because the text says it already is.
and the author applies this exact same logic directly to the healing of the physical body.
In fact, praying, "If it be thy will," for a known promise is considered an unstable act of wavering, and James chapter 1 specifically warns that this will result in receiving nothing. The text points out that when James talks about praying for the sick, he doesn't say the prayer of faith will raise them up if it's God's will. Not at all. He presents it with 100% certainty. If a believer prays without that total certainty, the text says they're just wavering like a wave of the sea.
So ultimately, the text defines this double-minded man as a believer who knows God can heal, but tragically questions whether he will heal, which creates a massive barrier of unbelief. Look, pretty much no Christian questions God's ability to heal, right? The wavering comes entirely from questioning his willingness. By failing to recognize healing as the known will, a believer accidentally prays with a double mind. And the author identifies this as the single biggest hindrance to experiencing promised healing.
To wrap up this explainer, the author's case in chapter 2 really comes down to this. Receiving healing requires moving past the myth of selective healing, fully understanding your scriptural inheritance, and claiming it without a double mind. It's a very systematic framework. It starts by reframing death not as a failure, but as the ultimate healing. It relies heavily on Jesus healing all and every person who came to him. It builds a very literal legal concept of an inheritance. And it concludes that absolute certainty is the only posture for a believer seeking physical restoration.
We're going to leave you with this really provocative thought to ponder. If healing is indeed a guaranteed legal inheritance, just as chapter 2 argues, how do believers navigate those profound moments when physical reality seemingly contradicts this theological certainty? It's a deeply complex paradigm, and it demands a pretty radical shift in how someone approaches faith, suffering, and the very nature of prayer itself. Thanks for joining us as we unpack this explainer.